Anybody like to share anything?
Hi, Ragi, it's Tony.
Hi, Tony. How you doing?
I'm good, good. Yeah, yourself?
Good to see you. Yeah, good. Thank you.
I just wanted to wish you and everybody else a happy Easter. That was the thing that I wanted to say.
Oh, thank you very much. Happy Easter to you as well. You got lots of
Thank you.
Easter breaks.
Not yet, but hopefully later today.
How's the situation for you in Edinburgh?
Good, good. It's I think like everybody else, it's been a strange transition to every day kind of being like the last day, the previous day. But actually, what I've realised is that it's kind of helped me to look at things that maybe I've not looked at for a while because I can't get too busy, so you're kind of focused on your own well-being and the well-being of your family. So I think it's very good. Yeah, yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah. Yeah, it's a bit like Groundhog Day. Remember that movie?
Groundhog Day.
Okay, great. Well, you look well.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks.
Bonjour Ragi.
Bonjour. Jean-Claude, how are you?
I'm fine. I'm very fine.
Good.
And I'm so glad to be with you. And I like so much to be in the silence with you. And what I wanted to share is since we say the confinement in French, I don't know the name in English.
So the literal translation would be confinement.
Confinement.
Yeah. Some countries are using the word lockdown.
And when it began, I felt at last this happened.
Oh.
Not that I'm happy for all the people who are in a bad situation, well, you can understand. But for me, it was, the world is settling down, and I can feel it. Well, in the first weeks, it was so easy to feel, and it makes me very easy to meditate, to let the day be free of choosing what to do and what not to do. And it was the first time in my life I felt such a thing, which was not only for me, but I felt that the world was slowing down and much more was stopping. And so it refers to myself, and in the same time, it refers to the whole world, which is in a different, how can I say, rhythm, different state of mind. And well, I just wanted to share this, this special time, and how it lets me be more secure, something like this. In Portugal, you remember we spoke about the child inside us, and it was something very important for me. And now I'm experiencing the welcoming of this child inside me. So that's all. Thank you. Thank you.
Jean-Claude, thank you very much. Merci. Is there any part of that you would like to explore more, Jean-Claude, or yes, you just wanted to share that?
Maybe explore more about the child. Yes. There is something I understood. Like everybody, my life was very full, not with easy things, and I forgot all my childhood until I was 7 years old, and I realized that in fact this child was very strong because of what was around him in his life, and yeah, I understood he was in one side he was very strong, and on the other side he was very in contact with nature, with the living essence of everything around him, and as growing up later, it was not welcome in my society, and so I have to forget it, and much more. I've got to be guilty about being so sensitive to things as I was when I was a child, and this time makes me going a little more in what I understand I felt when I was a small child. And I would like to go further, of course. And
Thank you. When you say further, Jean-Claude, what do you really mean?
we'd like to be able to welcome him more. But I think he has its own rhythm.
Yes.
And I see during this time, I'm free to do many things, and sometimes I do too much. I do Feldenkrais, I do Qigong, and something happened. I said, well, I would like to help the people sharing yoga with me during the class, and I would like to give them some video or some Zoom like we do, and it was very, very difficult. I did it 3-4 times, and all the people were very happy, but not me. And that was very, very interesting, because I'm not very good with internet, so I've got to learn how it works. This is first thing. Second thing, here where I am, it's not easy to get with internet, because it's low speed. I don't know how you say in English. And well, many things like this. And during the class, I was feeling very strongly the energy, the vibration of us together. And suddenly the video stopped, and I was just in front of emptiness. And oh, and it was like hot and cold water in the same time. And this is for me very interesting, because I feel that, well, I would like to help people, but it's as if life was saying to me, slow down and just bother about yourself, and the other, they will bother about themselves, and even it's some good yoga class, they will find it on the internet or anything like this. So maybe because I've got to je dois accepter de m'ennuyer. I've got to get bored a little and things like this, and not being that man who always want to do good things and meditate and so on, and but just let life be, and well.
Yes. Thank you, Jean-Paul. That's beautifully expressed. Absolutely. Um, I think for all of us, and I include myself in this, this big or subtle, whichever we're experiencing, this change in our daily life is bringing up things. And that would not be normal. Why shouldn't it bring up things? In other words, so if we look at it like that, it's natural that it's bringing up things. Because each of us, we get into patterns and rhythms and regularity, get into habits automatically without even consciously realizing it or deciding or choosing it, to maybe to cope, to manage, in some cases just to stay alive, but certainly to manage our emotions, to manage our thoughts, to manage our addictions. And suddenly, this change in our daily life is affecting the way we manage all these things in different ways for different people. So it's absolutely normal that certain things are coming up very strongly. Now, if what we call the mind, what I call the intellect, the ego, can see, first of all, that there's a judgment that comes up. The judgment will be some form of non-acceptance of what is happening within ourselves or in the world or in the other person. There's a judgment. This should not happen. I don't like this. This is unfair. All kinds of things. And then there's the secondary judgment. I should not be judging. We can look at it another way. There's the primary involvement in what's happening, which is the change, positive or negative change. And then there's the secondary involvement, which is some mental commentary, a judgment, a criticism, a dislike about how we are reacting to the situation. Look at that for a moment. So I was talking about this mechanism whereby there's a judgment, and that's just spontaneous in the moment, given a particular set of circumstances. And then there's what the intellect ego does, which is to judge that judgment. I shouldn't be judging. I shouldn't be involved. I shouldn't be reacting like this. Yeah, I shouldn't be feeling like this. So just if we look at that for a moment, and we call it some kind of pain or some kind of suffering, then the judgment, the primary judgment itself, the primary involvement comes up spontaneously, and that sometimes contains or is a form of suffering, is a form of pain, and we can recognize that, can't we? And then there's the secondary judgment or involvement, which is another kind of pain, another kind of suffering. That's really psychological pain, psychological suffering. And if we see that for a moment, the secondary judgment, secondary involvement, is really to do with what we feel, what we believe is right or wrong, should not be. This should not be happening, or this should be happening. And that secondary judgment involvement is based on that. So where we can immediately experience some relaxation through understanding what's happening is just to notice this. I've gone into the secondary judgment. I've gone into the secondary involvement. Yeah. And we'll explore in a moment how this has an impact on emotions like anger, fear, sadness, which are primarily biological reactions. What Ramesh used to call biological reactions, and how they become psychological stories or psychological reactions. So, for example, there could be a biological fear, which is just part of our life experience, part of our conditioning. And then there's a secondary fear, which is a psychological fear which appears, which is really a mental story, and it's based on should not, could not, this must not be, this must be, something like that. So if we check for a moment from our direct experience what's happening, we can maybe start to see these different mechanisms, and that could help the ego intellect. Of course, what's always being presented in this teaching and in many other teachings, spiritual teachings or psychological therapies of different kinds, is that the closer we look at these mechanisms, at a certain point we find that we don't actually have the control over what's happening. And that could be difficult for the ego, it could be releasing for the ego, depending on our conditioning, depending on what the situation is, yes? So if I just come back to what Jean-Claude's been sharing, in certain situations, even people like Jean-Claude who've been teaching and sharing for many, many years, and his students have been benefiting from what he's sharing and teaching, all of us who share, who teach in some form or the other, at some point we need a break. At some point, a break is really useful. And either just life will give us something, somehow force us to take this break through an illness, an accident, maybe somebody dies, something else. Or without even really quite understanding it totally, we recognize, actually, I need a bit of a break from sharing. And this could be because we need to recharge. It could be because there are certain old memories, pains, traumas, various things that are being triggered, and we need the time and the space to look at those, to heal those. If we take out the judgment of it, the right and wrong of it, then there's actually no problem. We just take the time. Yes, and as Jean-Claude said, his students can find other good teachers, hopefully, to satisfy their needs. And then without this judgment of not doing the right thing for oneself or for the other, there's an openness, there's a space, there's an energy to really take care of ourselves. In this case, we're talking about the inner child, to really take care of the inner child, to take care of the needs that we, as the adult, had forgotten, not recognized, ignored in some way. This is an opportunity to take care of it. Now, some of the things, it seems, from what I'm hearing from people or reading, not reading an awful lot, are things that are being triggered because we've spent a large part of our life suppressing them, ignoring them, not wanting to look at them. So we've developed coping mechanisms, all of us. And now, because of the change in our daily life and the activities and the freedoms we have in our daily life, we're not able to use maybe quite the same coping mechanisms or use them in the same way. They're not as effective in helping us to cope. And if we look at it as a bad thing, then obviously we're going to react by saying, okay, this should not be happening in the world, and all kinds of stories like that. Or if we're able to, we can try and look at it in a positive way and say, well, yes, it's not really what's comfortable for me entirely, but it is a marvelous opportunity. It is a marvelous opportunity. But this can be frightening. This can be uncomfortable. Really, the opportunity, if we put it in a very simple way, the opportunity is to once again look at, feel, ask oneself something like that. Who am I really? What am I really? What do I really want? How do I really want to live my life? For some, it might even be, what is my purpose? Should I change jobs? Should I find some other activity? Should I develop a new hobby? Some change which the ego might not like and the ego is resisting, life is forcing upon us. But rather than looking at it as a forcing, we can say life is giving us an invitation to step into something else. Life is giving us an invitation to realize something else about ourselves. And of course, automatically, as we realize something else about ourselves, we realize something else about other people, planet, the other beings that share this planet with us. We realize something very fundamental about the nature of life itself. And one of the aspects of this fundamental realization is that even though we've known this before, we've forgotten it, everything is always changing. Everything is a happening, as Ramesh used to put it. Everything is a happening meant to be. And when we recognize this, we have to also recognize that we don't have much control at all over this change. And part of the fear, the anxiety, the worry that people are experiencing at the moment is because the ego is really confronted with this. Can't control what's happening. I can control now what's happening in my room or my apartment or house. I can try to control how the people immediately around me behave, but even that seems to be impossible. I can see a friend of mine from Sweden, and in Sweden they're dealing with this differently to many other countries. So it'd be interesting to hear from him at some point if he feels like sharing what's happening there. And the other thing we might realize at some point is that what we call our mind, our ego, the intellect, is usually, nearly always, trying to find some reason for what's happening, and trying to find some solution or some way of changing what's happening to suit our idea of how it should be, to suit our idea of how life should be. If we look at that for a moment, the ego has hypnotized itself, in a way, into believing it could change things to suit itself. And we will confirm that by saying, here's the evidence. I did this and then this happened. I made an effort and then I got this. And the ego will then say, okay, it wasn't 100% of the time, but quite a lot of the time, the result of my effort was that I got what I wanted. So then it'll conclude, yes, okay, I can change what's happening. And at a time like this, where our usual tools, our usual strategies are being restricted, are being curtailed, we might start to see more clearly, well, actually, I'm not changing what's happening. What I call I, me, is not changing what's happening. It's changing anyway. It's a happening despite my effort. And then we have a concept which says, okay, so it's consciousness, life, universal energy that's functioning through us and making all these things happen. But before going into the concept, just if we look at it from our own direct experience, how much can we actually claim that we have this influence, that we have this power to change what is happening? Now, when we talk about the inner child, and some of you have come to the workshops and retreats I offer, and we've actually done exercises. Inner child conversations, inner child healing, letting the inner child express itself, holding the inner child, all kinds of exercises. And those exercises and that time we spend with what we call our inner child really seems to have helped. And if we continue to do it over a period of months or years, we definitely seem to experience a change. And the change seems to be for the better. It seems to be that our psychological and emotional suffering reduces. There's more love of ourself, more acceptance of ourself, more caring of ourself. Things like that. And we learn in the process to give ourselves what we didn't get when we were children, for example, or we didn't get in an earlier part of our life. We didn't get from some other situation in our life. And one of the core components of this, and I've received a lovely message from somebody which has reminded me, so I'll go straight to that, is that we have needed more love. All of us, it seems, maybe not all of us, but a great number of us on the planet didn't receive enough love, or the right kind of love. And when I say love, other core needs were not satisfied, or not satisfied enough. And for many generations, this seems to have been happening on this planet, amongst us human beings. So when we talk about the inner child, this is one of the ways of imagining giving ourselves what we need, or understanding the lack of what we needed. So we can identify what we need, and we can develop ways to give ourselves what we need. Instead of relying on other people entirely, or waiting for other people to give us what we need. And this is a challenge for most of us, because we haven't been taught in this way in our families, in our schools, in our religious institutions. For the most part, we haven't been taught to give ourselves more love, to give ourselves what we need. So we have to learn this approach. And that's sometimes difficult. But it's possible. It's possible for most of us to learn this. And it'll take different forms at different times of our life. That's why, luckily, there are so many different beautiful techniques and methods available, if we want to. Now, the paradox, or the contradiction in this Advaita teaching, is obvious. That on the one hand, we are saying we are whole, we are perfect, we're already consciousness, God, life, and as the individual, so-called individual ego, body, mind, organism, we have no control, we are not the authors, we are powerless. And in terms of our absolute nature, everything is all right. There's no need for change. Everything is perfect. And it really is a paradox. It's a contradiction for the intellect ego. And many of you have already seen that contradiction, understood that contradiction. So one of the ways I like to conceptually explain it is that it's to do with our so-called absolute nature and our so-called relative nature. And the reason I put the word so-called in there is because we don't actually have an absolute and a relative nature which are separate from each other. So again, it's just a conceptual description to say that we're taking care of the so-called relative part of ourselves, whereas the so-called absolute part of ourselves is already perfect, is already fine. And when we look at the concept, metaphor, the method of the inner child, it's important to understand this from the perspective of the adult ego that's meeting the inner child. In my opinion, it's important that the adult ego recognizes that this is an adult concept, absolute relative. It's even an adult concept to talk about needs, unfulfilled or fulfilled needs. And the so-called child, or specifically the child memory, what I call the cellular memory, doesn't have this comprehension, doesn't have this understanding. It's not that sophisticated. It's not that intellectual. And the simple way of understanding this is if you try and talk to a 2, 3, or 4-year-old about the inner child, about needs, about all this kind of stuff, it's probably not going to be interested. The child is not going to be interested. It's going to want to play, or it's going to want to express its emotions in some other way in the moment, spontaneously. Because the so-called child mind intellect is projecting less into the future, and it's going less into the past. In other words, it's living more in the present. Of course, the past exists for the child intellect ego, but there's less involvement in the past and in the future, and the mind intellect ego of the child is more in the present moment. So when we talk to the inner child, one of those most beneficial ways of talking to the inner child, and now I'm talking about the specific technique or the method of imagining that we're meeting ourselves as a child, sitting next to the child or holding the child in our arms, and talking to this imaginary child. And sometimes it feels very real, talking to the child as if it was 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 years old, or whichever age it comes up, with the understanding that we need to use a language, an approach, a presence, which is suitable for a child of that age. And therefore, not telling the child what to do or how it should behave, or not trying to explain what has happened or what has not happened, but simply to ask, what do you feel? What do you need? How do you feel? Is there anything you need? And this can be a very powerful, direct, simple way of accessing the cellular memory. The child memory, or the teenage memory, or the adult memory, whichever it is. Some part of the memory which has even been suppressed or covered up. And then as the so-called adult self, depending on what the child self has said, what's come up from the cellular memory, we can respond if we have the capacity and try and give the child what it needs. And it might simply be the child needs some quiet, some rest, needs some comforting, it needs some peace, it needs some space, it needs some time. Jean-Claude, would you like to add anything or comment? Share?
I just express all my thanks to what you just said. Yeah, not to speak with a child, but just be with it, be with him. And what you said, just how do you feel and what do you need, is get directly into my heart when you say this. So I just want to express you thank you. Very helpful for me.
Thank you, Jean-Claude. And I know you've heard most of this before, Jean-Claude, but it's sometimes useful just to hear it again. It's just a gentle reminder somehow.
Mm.
So, if you are, any of you, experiencing any kind of discomfort or what I call suffering or pain at the psychological or emotional level, and you're not even sure what it is, or you don't really understand what it is, one of the simplest things to do, so to speak, is to meet the inner child and have this conversation. And if you don't feel like doing that for whatever reason, that's also fine. Then there are other beautiful techniques like Ho'oponopono, where we just repeat, I love you, sorry, forgive me, thank you. Or even just, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you. And we imagine holding ourselves as a child. We imagine holding the inner child. And we just repeat, I love you, sorry, forgive me, thank you. Sometimes, and more, I'm realizing what my my spiritual teacher once told me, Ramesh once told me. He said, "You will not parrot my words." He said, "You will not parrot my words." And at the time, I didn't understand it. And for the first few years, when I was starting to share the teachings, concepts, I felt I was really parroting his words. I was using his concepts almost word for word. And I was comfortable with that. And because I felt that they had worked for me, and I saw them working for many, many hundreds, if not thousands of people that came to see Ramesh in Bombay. And then as the sharing started to change, I understood what he was saying. You will not parrot my words. And he told me that this is what Nisargadatta Maharaj had told him. Nisargadatta Maharaj had told Ramesh, you will not parrot my words. And if we look at the books that Ramesh wrote in the so-called early years, the first few years when he started sharing, it was very much the pointers that he had learnt or heard from Maharaj. Or they were more so-called traditional classical Advaita Vedanta pointers. And then the teaching and the concepts changed and they became simpler in a way, more direct, but very much aimed at daily life situations. And as Ramesh used to say, what's the point of this spiritual teaching or any spiritual teaching unless it helps us in our daily life? In other words, what's the point of it unless it helps us in our daily life? In other words, the ego, and this is one of Ramesh's concepts, the so-called ego is selfish. The ego is selfish, and the ego wants something. So fundamentally, there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with wanting something. Nothing wrong with wanting peace or happiness or the absence of suffering, whatever it is. Healing. So if we recognize this, there is an ego here, there's some kind of egoic structure, and this so-called egoic structure is appearing as a desire, as a wanting of something. So we don't have to feel bad about that in any way. And we shouldn't feel bad about it in any way. This is our life. We want to live it as fully, as harmoniously, as peacefully, as healthily, whatever it is you want from your life. And if everybody had this attitude towards themselves, we would start to experience actually more self-love, more self-acceptance, more compassion towards ourselves. And if everybody was doing this on the planet, automatically there would be less violence, less aggression. Automatically there would be less judgment. Maybe not the elimination completely of these things, because it seems these are also part of the basic duality of life. But there would definitely be less. We would be probably more empathetic towards others because we would be experiencing empathy with ourselves. Rather than see this selfishness as a negative thing, if selfishness is a form of self-love, self-acceptance, self-understanding, self-realization, then it's actually a very healthy thing. And that's why I say at certain moments in our life, we need to just focus on our own needs and say, I've got a limited capacity right now. I can't help anybody, or I can't help many people. I need to focus on myself. I need to help myself. But it seems that for a lot of us, the ego structure wants to help others because it obviously feels good at some level when we help others because we get some of our needs satisfied. We get love, we get recognition, we're heard, we're listened to, we're accepted, all these things. Yeah? But then there's a kind of dependency that's created as well. Then we become dependent on others for those needs to be satisfied. So this time we're living for a lot of us is challenging because one of the reasons is we're not able to get what we're addicted to. And we normally think of addictions in terms of substances. But we could also say we're addicted to love. We're addicted to attention. We're addicted to being seen, being heard. And that's one of the reasons we're being shaken at the moment. We're feeling uncomfortable. But if we look at all the different needs, and one of the nicest ones I've come across, the simplest ones I've come across, is the list of needs in the NVC system, the nonviolent communication system. I use that sometimes in the workshops. There's a list of all these needs. And if we look at that list, we'll start to recognize that many of them, most of them, can be self-satisfied. We can satisfy these needs ourselves. Even the need for love. And since it's Easter Sunday, then we can talk about what Jesus apparently said, which is love thy neighbor as thyself. Love thy neighbor as thyself. I never understood that while growing up, by the way. I never understood what he said. Love thy neighbor as thyself. It seemed to me impossible because I didn't love myself. I didn't feel like I loved myself. So I didn't feel like I could love I could really love my neighbor. But as we discover this potential we have to accept ourselves, to love ourselves, to care for ourselves, to listen to ourselves, even to hug ourselves. Maybe we want to kiss ourselves. We discover, I think, in my opinion, what Jesus was really talking about, which is the more we love ourselves, the more we accept ourselves, the more we nurture ourselves, then we have the capacity to love and nurture the other. And if he'd simply said, love yourself first, then you can love your neighbor, it would have been much clearer to me. I don't know about all of you.